What is the role of journalists when covering America's mass shooting crisis, and how can they responsibly report on tragedies like the recent shootings in Uvalde, Buffalo and Tulsa? Those are complicated but crucial questions to answer, says Dannagal Young, a University of Delaware professor who studies the impact that news stories have on the public. In particular, her research looks at whether the media has a bias in favor of covering specific events and individual people, instead of looking more broadly at what leads to tragedies such as mass shootings. This difference is called episodically framed stories versus thematically framed stories. Young unpacks why this matters, how the media should cover mass shootings, and the one question she says journalists should ask themselves. This interview has been edited for length and clarity. On episodically versus thematically framed news stories, there was work that came out in the early 90s looking at whether or not the way that news stories are told could affect the kind of attributions of responsibility that viewers or readers might make. So, if you tell a news story about individual people, individual problems, really following that story narrative arc, is it possible that you're actually going to encourage those readers and listeners to attribute responsibility and look for solutions at the level of the individual in the story? On whether the Uvalde shooting was covered more episodically or more thematically, I think it depends on what outlets we're talking about. I have seen a whole lot of attention paid to more thematically framed coverage that looks at the history of gun control in the United States, rates of gun violence broken out by state, etc. Those thematically framed stories contextualize what happened in Texas within a broader framework, a political framework, a cultural framework, a historical framework. That's thematic. However, as the story began to unfold, and we did learn about failures at the level of the Uvalde Police and the school police in particular, some of those stories really began to focus on the individual people, as opposed to thinking more broadly about gun violence as an epidemic in the United States. On how people understand news differently when it's more episodic and less thematic. When a story is told in terms of individual people, our brains are going to be activating constructs about this person in this place at this time.